Alright y'all, so quick disclaimer, things may sound a little similar in WoW's video today. That's because we both collaborated to bring you this versus matchup. The information leading up to these scenarios will be verbatim, but our conclusions and analysis will draw a much larger difference by the end. So stick with us, we didn't just copy and paste each other's content in this whole video. So if you want to go to the timestamp on the screen, you can actually jump ahead to the new information.
So we have been mulling over how we wouldn't survive and analyzing the science behind a multitude of video game scenarios and creatures. 95% of the time, it's safe to say most of us would be in the proverbial grave at the initial start of whatever outbreak, disease, or invasion overwhelmed the Earth. But what if we doubled back and discussed if two threats emerged at once to wipe out humanity and who would emerge victorious in a relative battle royale? Fortnite? No, not on these channels.
It's easy to discuss how infections and alien races would fare against the natural human race, as we have set defenses, societal guidelines, and overall standards of living. Humans as a species, without our technology or weapons at hand, are relatively weak as a race. So let's push humanity mostly to the sidelines today and pit two fictional dangers head to head in today's video.
This week, we cover a death battle of epic proportions. Who would win?
Left 4 Dead's green flu versus Halo's flood infection.
So to start things off, we have to come to a set conclusion of why and how these two widespread dangers would clash. These diseases with a high infection rate wouldn't just pop out of the blue and fight like something out of a screw attack death battle. So in order for the flood to interact with the green flu, two scenarios would likely have to be played out.
First of which would be a more simple variant, in that the green flu is already occurring on Earth and spreading like wildfire as the flood invaded the planet looking to increase their numbers, leading to a war of the virus and the parasites where the green flu has a more home field and timed advantage.
The second scenario would be that the flood had already invaded Earth and were swiftly wiping the human race out at focal points across the globe, with artillery and nukes not doing much to slow down the infection. So defense organizations and governments would resort to biological warfare and developing the green flu virus to possibly counteract and fight back against the flood, with varying results.
So before we delve into these two prime choice simulations, let's go over a few bits of information pertaining to the green flu virus and the flood infection, on basically how they spread and what they do, and also how they manage to build themselves up as a threat once their numbers have risen. The flood infection is one that is absolute and can entirely decimate a planet's ecosystem in mere days. But to accomplish this, the flood has multiple ways of infecting the local fauna and also flora and converting them into shambling biomass. So let's take a look at how the flood typically has an answer for any higher thinking species wishing to survive the onslaught. When the flood touches down on a planet for the first time, they have a tendency to drop a lot of material in the air upon their arrival. This isn't just non-lethal material either. These pieces of flood drop off whatever they enter the atmosphere in or on, which in turn seeds the area. Should anyone be located directly under or downwind from this impact site, these cells will float through the air and enter the lungs. Upon entering the lungs, the innate immune system is quickly overwhelmed and converted along with the lung tissue, leading to a quick suffocation for the host. But this infection process is not even the most effective. This is really just an unintended consequence of breaking through the atmosphere. For all those located near the presumably crashed ship or biomatter that survived impact, they will not survive long. The flood do not go in unprepared, usually having some sort of ability to pilot ships due to the hive mind they've created, or having access to the physical forms of whatever species they infected first. They will pretty much exit whatever they crash landed in and begin cutting down the natives of this planet. Infection forms, combat forms, carriers all spread out, infecting all those who are in the way. Dead tissue can quickly be reanimated via flood cells, so anyone who falls will quickly change. But it's not just those that fall. The flood is also banking on those that make it to temporary safety. Again, the flood aren't stupid, so they have contingency plans. Located in every single flood form is the flood supercell. This cell, upon coming into contact with other cells, engulfs it, breaks down the host cell, and then assumes a quasi-form of that cell. After trillions of times of this happening, the host is converted and changed into something that isn't even remotely made of the host anymore. Should anyone receive any injuries from, say, a combat form, like a minor cut, the flood cells will spread slowly at first, but then rapidly throughout the body. This could, in theory, allow the host to reach a safe area where they will succumb to the illness and moments later get back up and begin a new outbreak location. As the flood converts more and more as it moves across the planet, they begin to change the atmosphere too. Obviously, breathing is incredibly important for any species on their native planet, or I guess really in any instance. Let's say that you are a doomsday prepper. After the flood touched down, you ran inside your bunker where nobody knew about you or could even find you. As time passes, all radio signals cease, and it seems like the world is done, at least around you. You ponder what life meant, why this happened, but then a strange smell assaults you. You look to the vents and you start to see a green gas filtering into your bunker. Although this isn't gas, you see particles in it. This is the flood's endgame. The more they spread, the more there are. Flood are atmosphere changers. They produce flood spores which drift through the air waiting to be inhaled by any host. Much like when the flood entered the atmosphere, these spores will overwhelm the lungs of any hiding host, whether it be in bunkers, government facilities, or deep in forest miles away from people. It doesn't matter. You can't hide from your necessity to breathe. Even if you had filters and compressed O2 somewhere, you would eventually run out of air and you would have to breathe in the flood spore and be converted just like all the rest. So let's talk about host and longevity of the flood for a moment. When an infection form begins attacking a person, the flood forces a tentacle into the spinal cord of the host and begins attacking the nervous system. It begins by matching the resonant frequency of the host's neural tissue and, for all intents and purposes, essentially hijacks the system, killing the host in the process. Only one person has ever really been ignored by the flood, and this was Johnson from presumably his Boren syndrome from plasma grenades, but it was actually his Spartan 1 augmentations. They don't know if that makes him immune, but it does make him non-appetizing to the flood. And only one person has actually kept their consciousness after they were infected by the flood, and this poor SOB was known as Private Jenkins. This is really, though, the outlier. Most humans fall in seconds after the tendril stops the heart. At this point, the flood overrides the human body's natural DNA and then begins mutating it. The organs are liquefied and used as biomass for other areas, and the osseous cells are ramped up to almost cancerous levels, forcing a bony claw to grow out of the arms. The skin is liquefied to a certain degree as the creature looks like it could possibly also be decomposing. These are simply, though, the cells being broken down at a rapid rate. The head slumps over the shoulder as the brain is no longer piloting the meat suit and is more than likely searched for information from the infection form, or is liquefied if it contains no real information. This is the fate of most creatures large enough to substantiate a combat form. The infection form is what makes this happen. Roughly the size of a full-grown man's torso, this creature crawls on the walls and ground. Upon finding suitable hosts, they will lunge at them and begin their attack. The tendrils located on the underside of the body will pierce the skin, and everything mentioned previously is how you will meet your end. However, there are creatures who do not contain enough biomass for the infection to work properly. The flood does still have a purpose for them. Take the Kigyar and Ungoi, for instance. Due to their lack of osseous material and their size, the flood does not really have much to work with concerning how they're going to turn them into combat forms. While it has been done in a few instances, typically they will become the carrier form. This form is a bloated creature who shambles around the area, incubating infection forms. As they begin to grow inside the host, the skin stretches and pressure begins to build up inside. Popping this membrane will cause an explosion, which will send flood cells everywhere and will also cause wounds to anybody in the area. So you can kind of see where this is going. They will infect everyone in a splatter effect, but will also release flood infection forms to track down any who may have actually gotten away from the blast. As time passes, the flood no longer works with the aberration of native DNA. They will begin producing flood known as pure forms. These pure forms are able to mutate on command for whatever they need. Tank forms are massive, standing taller than Spartans, and will run in, tearing apart any species in its way. Another form is able to stand back and shoot spikes, and considering that these spikes are made of organic material from the flood, any hit on any defender will in turn cause that defender to become flood themselves. There are other flood forms like the proto-gravemind, gravemind, and keymine, but we will get to those later. The longevity of a flood form is unknown. Presumably after being locked in a Forerunner research facility for almost 100,000 years, many infection forms were released by the Covenant, starting a flood outbreak on Halo. Most of these flood infection forms were quite viable and converted almost everyone except for the Master Chief to flood. This is not to say that some weren't affected. As mentioned previously, it seems age does decrease the ability of the flood to infect, specifically concerning Private Jenkins. The flood form jumped on him but was not able to take over his body fully, leaving him trapped in his mind with some minor control. He managed to overpower the flood form at times of extreme pain and warned those around him of the infection, which actually ended up saving a lot of lives. Still though, this is seemingly an extremely rare situation, so the lifespan of a flood form appears to be greater than 100,000 years. So with that quick rundown of the flood infection and those affected by the the green flu done, which you'll have to go to WOWSuchGaming to check that out, let's jump into the first scenario that involves what would happen if humanity was already being smacked down by the green flu. To make a bad situation worse, the flood arrived to convert what's left of humanity to flood. Humanity made a terrible mistake. Genetic modifications have always been on the table as a way to extend life or take it away. Through the course of humanity's meddling, they inadvertently created the green flu. As it begins to run rampant across the planet, humanity struggles to outlive the actual disease, as those infected do have a ticking clock until their inevitable breakdown. As time passes, there is a swelling of infected of many different variants, with survivors attempting to make it through the month deadline. As the numbers begin to stabilize past their exponential growth phase, a bright green light is seen in the sky. The flood has arrived. As the ship crashes onto Earth, combat forms from creatures previously unknown pour out of the ship, and the air begins to turn a sickly green. All this noise would obviously attract a lot of attention from the infected on Earth. As they swarm towards one another like rabid animals, one has to imagine, how would this all go down? Well, the biggest issue is that parasites are very complicated creatures. Typically, their reason for being is to strip a host of nutrients to fuel their own growth and life cycles. Usually this comes at a great cost to the host and can cause debilitating symptoms like the ones seen with malaria, for instance. However, the term parasite given to the flood conceals its more sinister abilities. The flood are not parasites so much as they are supercells. While there is no doubt that this creature does convert a host for its own game, which by definition is parasitic, parasites usually have the host body still working in some capacity to fuel the parasite. The flood, however, takes everything away from the host. Bodily functions cease as the host is converted into pure flood on a cell-by-cell basis. The body is not substantiating the flood, the body is just literally being eaten by the flood. And in the end, it will cease to be anything it ever was. When the flood touched down in this scenario, it becomes a question of what is stronger, virus or cell. When a person is infected with green flu, the virus actually does alter the DNA to some degree, which means that the flood would not be essentially coming across just pure human DNA. Based on this, I believe it would take the flood some time to work out how to actually infect these infected. In this universe, the flood has tangled with humanity before, about 100,000 years previously, and as such, it does have access to our genetic mapping. With these new forms of humans mutated, the flood would have mild difficulty infecting them properly. While not impossible, it might be tougher to fight with the body, seeing as the flood spore would not be in the same environment it normally is. This is also not to say that the flood wouldn't be able to do it though. It is known that the flood, if not able to directly infect tissue, will actually save tissue for later. Assuming at this point that humanity, while low in numbers, is still present, the flood's best bet would be to infect hosts and begin fighting back. Infecting dead infected would be easier of a process, I imagine, as the virus would be null inside the body. Ultimately though, the supercell infecting someone already infected would have to deal with not only the scrambled human DNA, but the viral coding as well after the cell built the viruses and stayed in its DNA. Concerning hand-to-hand combat, there are many different variants of green flu infected, and when it came to just sheer size, there appears to be more tanks and chargers available due to the green flu than there are tanks available at the beginning of a flood outbreak. So when it comes down to actually fighting one another, I believe that in some degree, the green flu would have an upper hand in fighting back the flood, but it would be very short-lived. As soon as infected bodies, even those from normal infected, started dropping, the flood would be able to start attacking those bodies and then raising more combat forms, which we've seen in normal Marines. The second scenario seems to me to be right up humanity's alley. Upon discovering the flood has entered Earth's atmosphere, they would more than likely begin using everything they had in an attempt to stop the advancement of this disease. When nukes, carpet bombing, and just straight up sending in Earth's strongest and best soldiers produce no marked results, humans may turn to inoculations or even biological warfare. On this planet, there is a war much older than humanity, and it's much older than any war we've ever fought. It's older than our species, our ancestors, or even multicellular organisms. Prokaryotes and viruses have long been enemies attacking one another. In fact, every day, 70% of single-celled bacteria in the ocean are killed off by viruses. The viruses will attach to the cell, inject its RNA, use the mechanisms of the cell to build more viruses, and then the cellular membrane will rupture when it is just saturated with viruses. So in this scenario, humans managed to capture some flood and learned about the supercells. After experimentation, a virus was released and it had some promise. Unfortunately, due to the pressure of time constraints, there was no contingency should the virus mutate, mutate, and this virus turned out to be very mutagenic. It's difficult to know exactly how a virus would affect a flood spore or a supercell, but considering that yes, it is a cell, it in theory should have mechanisms in place that our cells do to operate. But once again, I must stress, this is alien. Viruses on this planet have evolved over time on Earth with the presence of viruses all around us. Our cells have learned to combat certain viruses to great success, but with others, we are not so successful. The viruses have adapted and learned how to bypass certain features on cells and inject their RNA material. If I had to just come out and say it, I'm sorry, I do not believe humanity could design a virus to attack an alien cell, mainly because viruses are very particular about how they attach to cells. And this is the crux of the issue. Without certain markers on our cells, the virus would not be able to attach to the cell, and it would basically think this cell is just inert. On top of this, even if it could, there's not a guarantee that the flood supercell would have a compatible version of reverse transcriptase to actually read the viral RNA. The only way humanity would be able to create this virus are under very strict and feverish working conditions. The flood spreads so fast and is so lethal that virologists would have to work in conjunction with microbiologists extremely fast, and assuming they found a way or just got lucky and the cells are similar enough to humans to be affected, this is the only way a virus would be able to affect an actual flood supercell, which is just literal dumb luck. So based on these two scenarios, one of two things could happen, yielding creatures infected by both. I believe that these creatures would not be permanent, instead they would exist for only what would be an incubation time. In scenario 1, assuming the flood is not affected by the virus and is able to infect cells with scrambled DNA, the flood would have to move through the creature on a cell-by-cell basis. Injuries caused by the flood infection would not cause the host to stop moving or become incapacitated until it was mostly blood. This is due to the fact that those infected with the green flu do not stop or slow down. They don't register pain, nor are they afraid. As such, they would keep moving and attacking as long as anything on them was left to attack with and that they can still control. The flood would have to convert major areas of the nervous system for this to properly work. As the green flu infected were converted, this would lead to skirmishes, but we will cover that momentarily. In scenario 2, this process might take longer. Should the virus work on the flood, this would require all cells becoming infected by the green flu. While I do doubt at this ability, which I will mention later, the virus would alter the flood DNA and hijack the supercell. One of the interesting aspects we could actually see is the green flu at this point would become even more virulent. With the ability to essentially hold supercells hostage, they could spread into bodies quite easily. Another thing to note is that the green flu can spread by air and rapidly mutates, and because of this, the flood supercell may not be able to adapt, and if it's susceptible to infection, this could spell the end for the flood cell. The virus versus parasite argument is one that would be quite interesting on a micro and macro scale. On the micro scale, typically viruses trump cells. This is due to the virus being able to force its way into a cell despite an immune system. The supercell has the ability to take over entire cells and change them into flood cells. This could, in theory, yield a cell with proper mechanisms in place to read a virus and lead to the alteration of a flood supercell by messing with the DNA itself. Still though, the flood supercell has not been known to be affected by other diseases, as understandably, no creature was really able to develop a cure or vaccine for it using native immunities, which presumably means viruses were not a possibility for curing it either. On the macro scale, this is an interesting fight. With the green flu infected meeting flood infected, it all goes down to who can infect who and who can maintain that infection. Should the green flu gain a foothold in the flood supercell, this could mean that the flood are susceptible and as such can be taken down to their last cell, and flood forms do die. You can actually stop them or incapacitate them, I suppose. But the issue is, should the flood already have landed on Earth, they are clearly smart, and depending on a population size that they infect, they are only getting smarter. Should any scientists or doctors be converted that may have had access to this project, the flood now have that information, and not to mention the natural occurring humans who are only carriers for the green flu exist. The flood could use this genetic information to make themselves immune. And like I said, it's still entirely possible that the virus has no effect, and in reality, the flood supercell could just hijack a green flu infected cell, simply alter the DNA of that cell, stopping production of the virus, rendering the green flu infection quite useless. So who wins? I have to give it to the flood 100%. Many species have fallen to the flood even after countless years of studies. As a species right now, we look to viruses as a way to bypass current issues we find ourselves in, which is antibiotic resistance in bacteria. To assume an alien species like the Forerunners, who were almost at godlike levels of technology, wouldn't have looked at a virus as a possible cure early on would be ludicrous. It's clear to me that any virus virus we could come up with on Earth would still be predicated on the knowledge and evolution of anything on Earth, and as such, the cellular markers and mechanisms being different in the flood would cause an incompatibility with the virus, so it would just simply float around in the flood body. The last thing I would note is that the green flu is highly mutagenic as well, should it have enough time around the flood cells to latch on, but this still would not indicate a win even later, seeing as the flood entered the atmosphere. They are clearly controlled by a hive mind. With humans falling left, right, and center, the flood would at minimum establish a proto-grave mine on Earth. Because of this, it's probable some very intelligent people would be converted, like those, like I said, that worked on the project, and with this collective brain power at its disposal, it could develop countermeasures to the green flu not previously thought of by an individual brain or scientist. Ultimately, I believe the green flu would really just eliminate humans faster. The flood would then swoop in and overtake the unarmed infected. Not to mention, as the flood gets smarter, they would begin using weapons, vehicles, and really anything humans would fight the infected with. But instead of human fear, which causes soldiers to turn tail and run from the fear of infection, the flood would have no fear as they couldn't be turned. So, shout out for WOWSuchGaming. Thanks for the collab, man. If you want to check out his side of the story, be sure to click the video at the end of this video. Moving out into the outro, I hope everybody enjoyed. I want to give a shout out to a few patrons. Thank you, Joseph Givens, Laffy No Skill, It's Not a Spoon, A. Laurantis, and Artyom Chornage. You guys are awesome. I appreciate the donations, and I appreciate the donations on Patreon from everybody else. You guys rock. Okay, so that's gonna do it for me. Go check out WOWSuchGaming's video, and I will see y'all in the next one.